Today we see over 100,000, soon to be over 120,000 people driven from their homes, an Armenian ethnic community that has lived there for over 2,000 years. The world will not forget this act of ethnic cleansing. For those of you who are not familiar with the situation, at the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were a number of Soviet socialist republics who declared their independence. Within those republics, there were autonomous regions, and one of those autonomous regions was Nagorno-Karabakh, and it declared its independence. The United States did not recognize the independence of not the republics, but of those who were the autonomous regions. Except we did when Yugoslavia broke up, because there was an autonomous region within the Republic of Serbia that was part of the Federation of Yugoslavia. And we recognized Kosovo's independence because we knew that the people there would be subject to ethnic cleansing if that independence was not established. And we waged war for the independence of that autonomous region. And we prevented genocide in one of the most important actions America took in the waning days of the 20th century. We unfortunately did not recognize yet the Republic of Artsakh, also known as Nagorno-Karabakh, but the situation is analogous. It was an autonomous region inside of Azerbaijan in Soviet days. And when they declared their independence, they said they need this independence or we will be subject to ethnic cleansing and genocide. Some wondered whether that was true. No one wonders that today. The vast majority have fled already. The sick and the infirm and the disabled are still there and still need to be evacuated. But ethnic cleansing and genocide is being visited by dictator Aliyev out of Baku, Azerbaijan, on the people of Artsakh. America must provide aid to those who are fleeing and have fled and are now in the Republic of Armenia. Armenia is a very small country that now has over 100,000, soon 120,000 refugees, and America should be there on the ground to help. And I'm proud that Samantha Power is on the head of USAID, is on the ground to try to deal with the situation. But believe it or not, the atrocities are not over. It's not just those who are being ethnically cleansed. It is not just those who will not be offered a penny for all the property that they have been forced to evacuate from. The houses are taken, the buildings are taken, the factories are taken, and Baku, an oil-rich country, Azerbaijan, has not offered a single penny, nor have they apologized for driving 120,000 and more people from their homes. But now Azerbaijan has its eyes on conquering the Republic of Armenia, whose independence we recognized in the early 1990s. Compare that to Ukraine. We recognize Ukraine's independence at the same time. We are providing tremendous aid to the people of Ukraine to be able to defend the borders that we recognized. We have to do the same for Armenia. And it is time for the United States to say that any attack and attempt to seize Armenian territory is the exact same morally as the attempt to take southern or eastern Ukraine. And if we provide weapons, and I'm not talking about the most sensitive and high-tech weapons, if we provide basic defense material to Armenia today, we will prevent a war in the Caucasus that mirrors in every way the war we're seeing in Ukraine. So a number of us are here to say that this ethnic cleansing and genocide is evil, to say that the attempts by Azerbaijan to conquer Armenia and the Republic of Armenia or any portion of it is evil, and to say that America must provide aid to these people who have been ethnically cleansed. I have quite a number of my colleagues who are here, and the first one I will call upon is Jim Costa from Central California.
Thank you very much, my colleague and good friend Brad Sherman. What we're talking about here this afternoon, Azerbaijan's horrific attack on the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, otherwise known as Artsakh, is about good and evil. And the evil that the Azerbaijani government is perpetrating upon these Armenian people who are being run off their native historic lands is wrong. The attempt on the Lachen corridor, which is the corridor that links Armenia to this territory that we refer to as Nagorno-Karabakh, otherwise known as Artsakh, is the vital link that provides the necessary food and aspects of life that sustain this area. Azerbaijan launched this attack on Artsakh and announced the evacuation of ethnic Armenians. The evacuation of ethnic Armenians. What does that mean? It means, I believe, ethnic cleansing of the region. And that's why this is so important that we bring the attention of the world to this horrific action by the Azerbaijan government. This road, the only road linking Artsakh to Armenia, is impacting 120,000 people. And it's estimated that maybe as many as 50,000 have already fled. 200 were killed this week. I sent a letter to the U.S. House of Representatives, the Foreign Affairs Committee, that one, we must hold a bipartisan congressional hearing soon to highlight the atrocities that are being taken. Two, as soon as possible, I think a bipartisan delegation should go to Armenia to raise the level of attention that this deserves. The House Foreign Affairs Committee must, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, must use its oversight powers to discuss how Congress can provide support for humanitarian assistance and to try to bring about conflict resolution. I've also called upon the Department of Treasury and the state to impose sanctions, real sanctions, and under the Global Magnitsky Act on individuals in the government of Azerbaijan. They must be held accountable for their horrific actions. For years, I've called, along with many of my colleagues here, for the United States to end military assistance to Azerbaijan and to assist in the demining. I mean, this is the right thing to do. Azerbaijan doesn't need our military assistance, and they are using it on the Armenians and the people in Artsakh. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the bipartisan resolution condemning Azerbaijan's blockade of Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, and we must resolve to do everything we can to ensure that this current dispute will end the suffering and the isolation of the people who are being impacted today as we speak at this time. So in conclusion, in the United States, our government must do more to show that we don't tolerate these atrocities that are being committed against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Let me tell you something. I come from the land of William Saroyan, the great Armenian Pulitzer Prize winner. Armenians settled in that part of California and elsewhere after the first genocide in the 20th century. The first genocide in the 20th century by the Ottoman Empire on the people of Armenia. And later on, when Hitler ascended to power and the atrocities were being planned, which resulted in the Holocaust, Hitler was supposedly reported to have said when his people said to him, his generals, well, if we do this, what will the world say? And supposedly Hitler responded by saying, What did the world say when the Ottoman Empire perpetrated the first genocide in the 20th century on the Armenian people? The world was silent. The Armenians throughout this land, in this country today, say never again, never again. But today, they're witnessing the ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Artsakh. The United States must do more to assert the leadership that needs to take place to ensure that these atrocities end and that we support Armenia, the people of Armenia, and its territorial boundaries. We're supporting the people of Ukraine and its territorial boundaries for all the right reasons. And for the same reasons, we must support the territorial boundaries for the people of Armenia. I thank you very much. And the next person, you got it?
Josh is next, so I just want to say...
Okay.
Jim, I think you speak for all of us in calling for Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act to actually be enforced and to cut off all military aid to Azerbaijan, and for us to apply the global Magnitsky sanctions on the culpable Azeri officials. With that, I introduce Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey.
Thanks, Brad. And thank you so much for organizing this. We're very grateful to you for doing that, and the Armenian National Committee of America, thank you so much for your leadership in the defense of Christians and for the Martyrs and 120,000 Reasons Coalition and all the people who are part of the Armenian Caucus and members of Congress. I'm Josh Gottheimer. I represent northern New Jersey, the 5th Congressional District, and I've been very proud since I'm in Congress, including, like the people behind me, to have always stood by and fought for our great Armenian American community in the United States. Of course, for me in New Jersey, where there's a very, very strong Armenian community and a proud one and makes our state richer every day. We're gathered here today because of, as you heard, the deliberate attacks against Armenians by Azerbaijan. Since the military operation Artsakh just days ago, more than half of the region's Armenians have fled as refugees. May the memories of those who were lost always be a blessing. And by coming together during this atrocity, we not only mourn the lives of those lost, but we continue to rededicate ourselves to recognizing and speaking out against genocide around the globe and ensuring that we stand united in condemning hatred and violence wherever it rears its ugly head. I believe it's our duty to speak out honestly about historical facts and recognize the massacre of 1.5 million Armenians, as well as the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Maronites, and other Christians by the Ottoman Empire. And it's our duty to recognize that as we speak, Armenians are being killed and displaced in Artsakh at the hands of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's horrific military offensive comes at the end of a 9-month blockade of Artsakh, which resulted in a humanitarian crisis. I know that it's never the wrong time to bear witness and tell the truth, and the United States should never be complicit in senseless murder. This Congress, like the people behind me, I'm proud to have joined with the bipartisan Congressional Armenian Caucus to write President Biden, Secretary Yellen, and Secretary Blinken to impose the sanctions we've talked about today on individuals in Azerbaijan's government responsible for attacks against Armenians. I've also continued to press the administration to end aid to Azerbaijan and urge Secretary Blinken to enforce Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act to restrict our military assistance to these bad actors. As we continue to see the rise in hate and of targeted violence against ethnic and religious minorities around the world, it is vital that we not conceal or be bystanders to evil. I'll continue to stand strong with our ally, Armenia, in the face of threats and continued attacks from its neighbors, as we unfortunately continue to see even in these last couple days. That includes continuing our call for the release of Armenian prisoners of war detained by Azerbaijan, pushing the administration to cut aid to Azerbaijan, and continue support for critical humanitarian assistance to those suffering in Artsakh, including refugees. Please know that you have a very strong ally in the United States Congress, and that my door and those behind you, our doors are always open to you. Thank you, and God bless the greatest country in the world, the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another great American from New Jersey, Chris Smith, who has served for his congressional career on the Foreign Affairs Committee and has always fought for human rights. This is a bipartisan press conference. Let's hear from Chris Smith.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brad. As we meet here today, a second Armenian genocide is underway, brought about by Aliyev, a man who has a terrible record on human rights, even as it applies to his own people. I've met with him in the past, twice in Baku in 2013, 2014, and raised issues relevant to Nagorno-Karabakh, but also to his own people, who he puts behind bars, who he tortures, including Radio Free Europe stringers for that organization. This man has a terrible record on human rights, and now he is unfettered in his hate towards the Armenians and is committing, as we meet here today, the second Armenian genocide. I've chaired 2 hearings, one in June and another one just a few weeks ago. Emergency hearing was the last one. And we heard from Ocampo, who's the former chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, who called this for what it is, a genocide. Then he was talking about the deliberate starvation that they were imposing upon the people of Armenia. And now it's at a barrel of a gun, and this so-called ethnic cleansing. That doesn't say it well enough when we all say that word. This is a genocide. We call on the administration to do even more. Samantha Power is there, as we know, and I'm very glad that our USAID administrator has raised the issue with all involved, providing humanitarian aid. It's got to get there quickly because people will die, and certainly they're very, very much at risk as they flee, which should never happen. And matter of fact, this, to me, reminds me of what happened in Srebrenica when so many people were killed in that genocide. Frank Wolf, who led the effort with regards to Sudan years ago, when nobody would call it a genocide, he's here with us today and has been outspoken in his strong condemnation of Aliyev. But again, Aliyev should be at the criminal court for crimes against humanity, which he is committing, again, as we meet here today. Last week, I introduced legislation called Preventing Ethnic Cleansing and Atrocities in the Nagorno-Karabakh Act, H.R. 5686, joined by Brad Sherman, who's the lead Democrat on the bill, Gus Bilirakis, and many others. That bill would do the following things: dispatch U.S. diplomats to the region to monitor the situation, but not to monitor it the way we had it during the wars in the Balkans. We would have people there from the European Union and some from America who would take notes as to how many people were being killed. Frank and I went there so many times when Milosevic invaded, and it was like, what are you doing? You're just, what happens to these reports? So we want monitoring with action attached to it. It would institute 24-hour video monitoring of the Armenian cultural sites, authorizing humanitarian assistance. Again, some of that is already flowing, and I congratulate Samantha Power on that. Impose new sanctions. I was the House sponsor of the Global Magnitsky Act. We attached it to a must-pass bill because it was tied up, but it is the law. There are very serious sanctions that could be imposed now, today, on Aliyev and all of his gang, so that they can't do business with America and they cannot get a visa, 2 of the main parts of that sanctioning regimen. Do it. Don't wait as people are dying and starving. And, of course, the trek of those who are exiting, that is a very perilous thing with people with bayonets and guns surrounding you. It would provide foreign military financing to the Democratic Republic of Armenia, which could be very helpful, we think, to them. And important, terminate all U.S. military aid to Azerbaijan by repealing the presidential waiver of Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act. That needs to be done. Doesn't take legislation. We should pass this legislation immediately, but the president can do it this afternoon if he was so inclined. Thank you.
Thank you. Now my good friend from California, Lou Correa.
I want to thank everybody for being here today. I'm Congressman Lou Correa, represent Central Orange County, California. Spent a lot of times in California's legislature, and I remember voting, co-authoring resolutions, remembering the plight of the Armenian people. And you think about that, history, remembering history. Well, ladies and gentlemen, history is being repeated today. We cannot wait. We cannot let it happen. If there's one thing I'm going to do today is ask you, do not let this happen. Do not let us in that building wait. Take action right now. 120,000 reasons. 120,000 lives. Lives that are suffering right now, human beings, can't let history repeat itself. Please make sure the next time you're here, double the amount of people that are here. Make sure your voices are raised loudly, because in that building, we manage by crisis. Today, one crisis, tomorrow, the next crisis. You have to make sure that you remind us, and we're on top of this. Please make sure we take action so that history is not repeated. Thank you very much.
We're going to hear from a number of the groups that helped us organize this press conference right after we hear from Haley Stevens.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Congresswoman Haley Stevens, representing Oakland County, Michigan, and Michigan's 11th District. And I join with my colleagues in a bipartisan way to call attention to what is happening in Nagorno-Karabakh, and particularly the innocent people whose lives are in danger, the innocent lives that have been lost. I want to thank the Armenian Assembly. I want to thank the Armenian community of Michigan for their steadfast dedication to engaging elected officials. I came to Congress and we recognized the Armenian genocide after years and years and years of work, and we absolutely cannot see that happen again. And what has been boiling over for too long this year is now at a pitch fever. We see a refugee crisis, and we see an attack on Armenia's sovereignty. And it is wholly unacceptable. I have joined in support in calling for sanctions, in particular against the Azerbaijani officials. That needs to happen. It's grateful to see Senator Gary Peters from Michigan in Armenia just this weekend. Obviously, Samantha Powers from USAID is there now. We cannot wait another minute. And this gathering today with so many of you is shining a light. And I want you to know that I am using my platform to call attention to what is happening in a sovereign, democratic nation, an allied nation of the United States. The Armenian people deserve the best. They deserve our friendship. They deserve our support. And they deserve all it takes to prevent the worst from happening. So we stand by you today, tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, and we certainly say never again. Thank you.
Now I believe we have a spokesperson from the Armenian National Committee of America. Or do we? Yes.
For In Defense of Christians.
Okay, so we have a representative for In Defense of Christians.
Thank you, Congressman. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Richard Gazelle from In Defense of Christians, and I'm honored to be joined today by a diverse coalition of partners and organizations, including In Defense of Christians, For the Martyrs, and the 120,000 Reasons Coalition, to draw attention to the ongoing and active persecution, even genocide, of Christians in the Middle East. IDC began its fight to advocate for persecuted Christians in the Middle East nearly a decade ago, as the ISIS Caliphate was conducting a genocide against Christians in Syria and in Iraq. However, since the territorial defeat of ISIS, not much has changed. Christians in the Middle East are still subjected to intense persecution by jihadist organizations, thuggish autocrats, and racist governments. In the span of the 20th century alone, the population of the Christians in the Middle East has plummeted from 20% of the total population in the Middle East now to less than 2%. This is very concerning. I'm often asked why we fight. Why does In Defense of Christians fight? Why does the coalition fight? Well, there are at least 120,000 reasons why we fight. As we speak, and for the last 10 months, Azerbaijan, a beneficiary of U.S. foreign aid, military assistance, has been conducting a genocide against 120,000 Armenian Christians in Nagorno-Karabakh, also known to Armenians as Artsakh. After a 10-month blockade aimed to starve Armenian civilians into submission, Azerbaijan bombed them into submission. Azerbaijan is now completing its mission to cleanse the area by expelling the 120,000 civilians, and is now completing that cleansing from the home that Armenian Christians have called home for the last thousands of years. creating a humanitarian crisis even before our eyes. All while Azerbaijan continues to this day to enjoy American military assistance due to a legal loophole. The United States must discontinue this loophole, the presidential waiver to Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act. The U.S. must discontinue military assistance to the brutal dictatorship and must prioritize humanitarian aid and assistance to the Armenian Christians who for thousands of years have called Artsakh home. The sad reality is that Christianity throughout the Middle East now finds itself on the brink of extinction, which sadly may come to fruition within our own lifetimes. And with it, a 2,000-year-old Christian heritage would also disappear. This is not a political matter. In fact, it's more than a humanitarian matter, although it is a humanitarian matter. It's what we call a civilizational crisis. The Middle East, Christianity in the Middle East, represents a common heritage shared by worldwide Christendom, including all of us, Western Christians. Whether we realize it or not, it provides authentic access into the mind, culture, and worldview that gave rise to Christianity 2,000 years ago. If the true Christian heritage of the Middle East disappears, it will leave an irreplaceable void in its wake, and that is why we fight. For 2 millennia, Christians in the Middle East have been stuck in the middle, with no seat at the table and no one to speak on their behalf. But today, these folks standing behind me, and all of you here today, this coalition, we all speak and fight on their behalf, and we won't give up that fight. This afternoon's press conference is an important opportunity to hear from a variety of experts, community leaders, representatives, and public officials about the issues that affect Christianity in its very home in the Middle East. On behalf of In Defense of Christians, For the Martyrs, and the 120,000 Reasons Coalition, I want to thank the members of Congress who have joined us today, in particular Congressman Sherman for being our host. He's always been a friend and a true supporter to this cause. Thank you all for being here.
Hear from the other groups, or
Yes, sir, we have a coalition.
okay? So yes, let me point out that there were at least a dozen other members who intended and wanted to be here. As you may have noticed, this is a period of some disquiet here in the United States Congress. Now let me call up a spokesperson from the Armenian National Committee of America.
Thank you, Congressman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank our host, Congressman Brad Sherman, our organizer and coalition partner In Defense of Christians, for bringing all of us together for a day of advocacy on human rights issues affecting all of our persecuted brothers and sisters. Today, as Americans, we are rightfully, righteously angry that our government, the Biden administration, has armed and abetted, aided and emboldened Azerbaijan's oil-rich Aliyev regime that is today committing real-time genocide against Artsakh's 120,000 indigenous Armenian Christians. As you all know, Azerbaijan's aggression, with the solid backing of Turkey, has caused immense suffering and has violated international law, including Articles 2B and 2C of the Genocide Convention. We gather here today to hold our government accountable, to save all that can be saved, and to rededicate ourselves to the proposition that this must never happen again to those remaining on the ground in Artsakh, those living in fear today in Armenia, or any people in any place around the world. President Joe Biden's recent words at the United Nations General Assembly ring all too hollow. If we abandon the core principles of the United Nations to appease an aggressor, can any member state of this body feel confident that they will be protected? There is truth in his word, but no action to follow them up. Our State Department recently vowed before Congress that it would not tolerate any Azerbaijani attacks on Artsakh, and then it did just that. we have seen no American leadership at all against Ilham Aliyev, this generation's Saddam Hussein. Only empty promises for Armenians, arms for Azerbaijan's military, flowers at Artsak's funeral, a betrayal of the very principles we claim to champion. As the granddaughter of a genocide survivor, with family and friends driven from Artsakh this very week, it's hard to hear the U.S. proclaim, never again. Never again is becoming an empty promise while we ship arms to the side doing it again and again, while blocking U.S. aid to Artsakh during 9 long months under blockade. The record shows that the administration did not lift a finger to break Azerbaijan's blockade. No airlift, no cutting off of military aid to Baku, no sanctions on Aliyev. A shameful abandonment of our moral and legal duty. A dangerous signal to the authoritarians of this world, and a green light for the next genocide. Even at this late date, after more than half of Artsakh has been forcibly ethnically cleansed, President Biden refuses to enforce U.S. law restricting aid to Azerbaijan, refuses to enforce Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act. This is a message of weakness, not strength, of surrender to forces of intolerance, of a betrayal not only of our values but of our interests, because Azerbaijan is not our ally. They bust our sanctions and block starving children. The Aliyev family runs an oil-rich dictatorship. Their children own hundreds of millions of dollars of property across Europe and the Middle East. They do not need and surely do not deserve our American tax dollars. We can stop that aid today. The president can enforce Section 907, or our Congress can roll back the president's authority to waive this law. It is that simple, if the political will exists. We are blessed to stand today in solidarity with our partners in support of persecuted Christians in Artsakh, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and around the world. We must, for all of these at-risk faith communities, demand American leadership, American action. For Artsakh, that begins with calling out Azerbaijan's genocide against Artsakh, then cutting off military aid to Azerbaijan, enforcing sanctions against its dictator, and sending robust U.S. humanitarian aid to more than 100,000 homeless refugees. Here in Washington, that means holding the Biden administration accountable for its complicity. For absent such accountability, for as long as genocide remains good for business, we create the conditions for genocide. And that we cannot and will never accept. Thank you.
We have yet another speaker from New Jersey, the co-chair of the Armenia Caucus, ranking member of the Commerce Committee, Frank Pallone.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Brad. I don't really know what to say today. I want to say that we've worked with the Armenia Caucus. I was one of the founders for so many years, and one of our major priorities was Artsakh. Sure. Thank you. I said I was one of the founding members of the Armenia Caucus and worked for protecting the rights of the people of Artsakh for so many years with the ANCA and Armenia Caucus and so many members of Congress and Armenia diaspora here in the United States. So what's happened in the last week or so is very difficult for me to talk about. The sense of loss is really terrible. And I have to say that with the ANCA and other organizations, we have been trying to put the clarion call out for a number of years, and particularly in the last 6 months, that Aliyev and Azerbaijan's goal was to ethnically cleanse Artsakh. In other words, basically get rid of all the Armenians, take their land, and force them to flee, if not be killed in the process. And that's exactly what we're seeing unfold. So I would say maybe three things. One is we have to do whatever we can so that the people of Artsakh, if they decide to leave, have a way of doing so without being killed, without being hurt. At the same time, for those who would like to stay, they should be able to. They should be able to keep their homes and their lands and their property and feel safe. And the only way, in my opinion, that that's going to be accomplished is through some international intervention. That's not going to be accomplished because of some paper agreement, if they even do have a paper agreement that Azerbaijan decides to negotiate. It's got to be through international efforts, international humanitarian efforts to make sure that the people have food and they're safe, and if they want to leave, that there's a way to do so without being hurt or harmed, and guarantees for their property as well as their lives. And that can only be done through some sort of international force that comes in to Artsakh and can defend them in some way from Aliyev and Azerbaijan. So that's what we're trying to achieve, and we've been calling upon the State Department and the Biden administration to try to accomplish that. But I also want to go beyond that, because I have to be honest, my fear goes beyond Artsakh. It was only a few days ago that in, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, Nyachevin, that which was like Artsakh, was an Armenian territory at one time that Aliyev years ago, Aliyev the father, years ago ethnically cleansed. And it's clear that when Erdogan met with Aliyev in Nyachevin about a week or so ago, that they were putting out rhetoric about seizing the southern part of Armenia. They talked about the rail corridor. They said that there was a forced agreement with Armenia and Artsakh after the 2020 war that allowed them to have transit through the corridor. But that was a forced agreement, and it certainly doesn't involve seizing the territory. So my fear is that this goes beyond. This is not only that we need to protect Artsakh and those who remain, but also that we need to use, as I came in, that the United States has to be forceful and use sanctions and specific acts, no waiver of Section 907, sanctions, clear actions that will indicate that the United States is going to come to the support of Armenia if there's any further intrusions on the territory of Armenia itself, including the southern part. I have absolutely no doubt that the goal here is to wipe not just Artsakh off the map, but to wipe Armenia off the map. I mean, that's the goal here. Anybody who thinks otherwise, in my opinion, is kidding themselves. And so our goal is not only for an international force to protect the people of Artsakh and the humanitarian assistance, but also some sort of security guarantee between the United States and Armenia, that Armenia itself is not threatened, particularly the southern part of Armenia. Now, I'll just say one more thing, and that is that when we were in Yerevan about a year ago with Nancy Pelosi and Anna Eshoo and Jackie Spear, we were there. We were basically told at the time by Pashinyan that they were willing to, that they wanted more security efforts on the part of the United States. And that's got to proceed. In other words, whether that means, security assistance in terms of weaponry, in terms of training, or ultimately in terms of some sort of security guarantee. That has to proceed as well, because that's the only way that Armenia is going to be able to remain a free and democratic nation, is if ultimately they join NATO and they become part of the Western Alliance. I know I've already said too much, but I know that your focus today is on Artsakh, and I don't mean to take away from it. We have to do all the things that are said, but we can't lose sight of the fact that this is not just about Artsakh. There's a much larger plan here that involves Armenia itself, and that we need to move full force and quickly towards protecting Armenia as well. So thank you. Thank you, Brad.
It's now my pleasure to call upon Frank Wolf, who in 1998 authored the International Religious Freedom Act. Frank?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I want to thank the Congressman for being here and getting involved in this very, very important issue. In Nagorno-Karabakh, we see ethnic cleansing of Armenians by the Azerbaijan government. I have been there and I've seen it, and I know how troubled it is for the people. Keep in mind, Aliyah's father was the head of the KGB. There is no way that this administration ought to give one more penny beginning Monday to the Azeri government until this completely stops and there's a reverse. Also, it is shocking that there are lobby firms in this city that represent the Azerbaijan government. How do you represent a government that's bringing about genocide and ethnic cleansing? Don't you remember history of 1915? I would say to those law firms, call the Azeri government, tell them to get out and stop, or drop them as a client. Next, in Egypt, we see growing persecution of the Coptic Church. While the U.S. is giving Egypt over $1 billion a year, we see the Coptic Christian community being persecuted. We see anti-Semitic literature in the textbooks. I was in Egypt one time, and I remember I met with a leader of the Jewish community. And I said, how many Jewish people are left here? We want to help. She said, Mr. Wolf, probably 25 or 30. Right now it's down to three individuals, and Egypt still has anti-Semitic literature in their textbooks and anti-Christian literature. This has to change, and if it doesn't change, the administration and the Congress ought to cut the foreign aid of Egypt. That's the only thing they understand. And lastly, in northern Iraq. In northern Iraq, Christians are under severe pressure, and many are fleeing the region. We should be helping to stabilize the Christian community in this area. Keep in mind, more biblical activity took place in Iraq than any other country of the world other than Israel. Abraham's from Iraq. He's from Ur. That's Nasiriyah, modern day Nasiriyah. Daniel lived in Babylon. Christians in northern Iraq and in Iraq need help by AID. And also they need to help the Yazidi community. There are still 2,700 Yazidi women and girls that have not been reunited with their family. Part of what's going there is the responsibility of the United States and what took place in Iraq. So we should be aiding the Christian community in Iraq and aiding the Yazidi community. The Biden administration can do this, so I call on the Biden administration to act today or Monday, and the Congress to back them up with it. Thank you very much.
We do have 5 more speakers. I'll ask them to keep it brief, and we'll start with Keith from the Communications Advisors from the group 120,000 Reasons Coalition. Oh, that is the best speech given today. And now we have, I know, I can read. Gia from, who is a founder of For the Martyrs.
Christians around the world are under attack. My name is Gia Chacon. I'm the founder of For the Martyrs, a nonprofit organization that works to raise awareness about the crisis of Christian persecution, advocate for religious freedom, and provide aid to suffering Christians around the world. I want to thank In Defense of Christians, Congressman Sherman, and the 120,000 Reasons Coalition partners for co-hosting this press conference today. 1/3 of the world faces religious oppression, and an overwhelming 80% of the oppressed are Christian. This makes Christians the most persecuted religious group. As we stand here today, according to Open Doors US, there are over 360 million Christians who are facing persecution solely because of their faith in Christ. I have been to the borders of war-torn countries. I have sat in the desert camps of people who have been imprisoned, persecuted, killed, and pushed out of their homes solely because of their faith. Their only crime was being Christian. We are witnessing an era where it has never been more dangerous to be a believer in Christ. There is a genocide underway in Armenia. 120 Armenian Christians are facing starvation, gross human rights violations, and being forced out of their historic land in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh. Over 1,000 Christians were slaughtered in Nigeria in the first 100 days of this year alone. The Christian population in Iraq and Syria has diminished by over 80% in just one generation. Christians around the world face imprisonment, loss of their businesses, torture, and even death solely because of their faith in Christ. These Christians around the world have a question. Who will be their voice? Who will be their advocate? Who will protect them? When speaking of genocide and atrocities, President Biden has said time and time again, we recommit ourselves to never again allow an atrocity like this to happen. We are asking President Biden and his administration, where are you now? Where is the United States now as a genocide is unfolding in front of our eyes and Christian persecution is skyrocketing like never before? We are calling upon United States Congress and the Biden administration to keep their promise, to uphold the standard for international religious freedom, to intervene to stop the genocide happening right now in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, to sanction countries that are led by dictators and terrorists, and to protect Christians around the world who innocently face persecution because of their faith. Thank you.
We have 3 more speakers, but I want to open it up to a few questions from the press if you have a particular question. And I know Chris and our time is short, but we are available for a couple of questions. My God, I've never seen a press. Oh, go ahead.
I'm not a member of the press.
Well,
On this day, but what do you believe to be the main obstacles for closing these sanctions on Azerbaijan and stopping immigration? What's stopping it?
I see Azerbaijan's argument that somehow they're policing their border with Iran, and Iran is not a friend of the United States. And I see oil power. This atrocity wouldn't happen if only God had put the oil in a different place.
If I could just add to that, I had introduced in 2015 the Azerbaijan Human Rights and Democracy Act, tried very hard to get it passed, and the lobbyists right here in Washington, including Podesta, they work for that government, the Aliyev government, and they prevented it. So all of the moneyed interests here in Washington that front for human rights abusers need to be exposed. They need to look within their own souls and say now they are enabling, and it's not unwittingly, they are enabling a terrible, terrible crime against humanity that's going on right now. Aliyev ought to be at the ICC. There ought to be an investigation opened up on him and his top leaders for crimes against humanity and a host of other. He's committing genocide in real time, like I said earlier. And as Brad said, oil talks, money talks. And again, all of these lobbyists who just, I find it appalling. And Frank has called out so many, Frank Wolf, over the years, who front for these. We saw it during the Ceausescu regime. I had a bill in to take away most favored nation status for Nicholas Ceausescu, a brutal dictator, killed Christians, turned toilet paper turned Bibles into toilet paper as a terrible degradation, did horrible things. Tortured the Securitate, his secret police, the equivalent of the KGB, were second to none in their atrocities. We had all kinds of members in this House and Senate who refused to see it, and of course, it was the lobbyists, the people here on Capitol Hill and K Street that talked and said, look at the good things they do. And they would come in with bullet points that were filled with nonsense about how good he was, and we hear the exact same thing current day with Aliyev.
This is a crazy day for a lot of us. I am going to have to leave soon, but I want to call upon Endies. I'm not doing a bad. Zemenides. I know, but I'm terrible at pronunciation. I haven't mastered English yet. Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council.
Thank you, Congressman Sherman, and thank you, Congressman Smith, for always putting so much attention on it. My role was supposed to be different today, but as we sit here and talk about the disappearance and the threat of extinction of Christians in their historic homelands, it cannot be lost on us that the first Christian nation is under attack again. The first. And if the first can be attacked with impunity and can disappear, ironically, under the tenure of the same administration that recognized what happened to them a century ago and turned around within months and forgot that recognizing the Armenian genocide means nothing if you don't stop the next genocide. And I'm sorry, I can't congratulate Samantha Power for being in the region, because she knew what she did wrong during the Obama administration. She left the Obama administration, apologized for not recognizing the Armenian genocide, did no airlift, and is now, as Anka has said, showing up for the funeral. For those people who are saying that maybe it's a voluntary deportation, well, let's see how voluntary it would be for you if you were being starved out and bombed and threatened. There should be sanctions, sanction the Aliyev family, sanction Azerbaijan. We cannot let Caspian oil be our 30 pieces of silver as we stand along and be Judas, and nobody here should accept being Pontius Pilate in 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Indy. Next, I'd like to call up Betty Tekeski from she's an Ethiopian advocate from the American Ethiopian Public Affairs Committee. Betty, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Betel Sheba Tekesta, and I'm a member of the Ethiopian community and a practitioner of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo faith. Before I start, again, thank you to Congressman Sherman and Congressman Smith and everybody else, the hosts, in Defense of Christians, who's made this possible for us to outline some of our concerns and the things that are going on in Ethiopia. Not pleased, but grateful that we're here to listen to and share other communities and what's happening with the Christian communities in Armenia, in Nigeria, and elsewhere. And Ethiopia is a very similar case. I'm trying to keep everything very brief, so I'll start with this. Let's get that. When I spoke to a friend just earlier today saying that I'm going to speak about the persecutions of Orthodox Christians in Ethiopia. My very American friend said, I thought Ethiopia was a Christian country. And that just kind of speaks to how ignorant a lot of people are about what things are happening when we see different headlines and other political jargon being placed on headlines about the country and what's going on. And Ethiopia's persecution of Orthodox Christians has been going on for decades. And it's very alarming that most people are not informed about what's happening. And just recently, a month and a half ago, 577 people were killed in one day in a bombing of a monastery. And it received no news. And these are the kind of things that we're continuously seeing on a daily basis with persecution of our brothers and sisters. And the question is why? Why is this happening? Why aren't we getting any acknowledgement? Why isn't there any policy that's coming out of the Biden administration, of any international, any government, any institution to address this? And the simple fact is, false information is being put out there, and the different tags are given, and people are just not well informed. But what's happening is grave. What's happening is hundreds of thousands. 44% of Ethiopia's 120 plus million people are of the Orthodox faith. Churches have been burned, priests have been killed. In February of this year, thousands were arrested for wearing black to protest what was happening to our church. We stand outside of the State Department protesting week after week like crazy people, and we don't get enough recognition. It's because people don't understand, and they think it's political, they think it's tribal, and they think it's something that's just not worth mentioning. But what's happening is sincerely grave, and people are dying on a daily basis and misunderstood. And the last, one thing, if I could at least, compel all of you to Google, research, and find out and be a voice to this, to what we're advocating for, is understand that Ethiopia established Christianity in the 4th century. It's one of the first regions in the world to establish Christianity. Christianity was the state religion since then until the overthrow of Haile Selassie, Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. And since then, we've seen the Derg regime, that was a communist regime, a Marxist regime. Since then, we've seen the TPLF, which is another Marxist, Leninist regime, masked by democracy. And now we have the Prosperity Party that's pushing evangelical gospel ideals, however, not doing anything that's evangelical or Christian, and has caused war after war in just the 5 and 6 years that they've been around. And all the while, Christians are being persecuted, arrested, priests are being massacred, beheaded, and this is happening in increasing, alarming frequency. And we need help. We need help from the communities who are concerned of their own, Christian persecution and other religious persecution. We need help with congressmen and policymakers to pay attention and help us make sure that the government is being held accountable and not getting any incentives and money and donations from the American government, from American taxpayers, until all of these things cease. But at the very, very least, we need the recognition and the acknowledgement so that people are recognizing what's happening and boldly help us advocate for it. I thank you all sincerely. Bye-bye.
We're running low on time here, but we do have one final speaker who is an old and very close friend of In Defense of Christians. Stephen Howard is Director of Policy and Outreach at the American Task Force on Lebanon. Stephen.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to thank Gia, Rich, for the Martyrs, IDC, and the 120,000 Reasons Coalition. Today I want to talk about 3 things. Why Lebanon matters for Middle Eastern Christians, the danger of it collapsing, and also why it matters to the U.S. and what the U.S. can do to prevent this from happening. But if you only remember one thing about Lebanon today, I want you to remember what St. Pope John Paul II called Lebanon, a message. We've heard a lot today about what types of models don't work for Christians in the Middle East, but we have one in Lebanon that actually does. A pluralistic democracy with religious freedom. In fact, it was the IDC podcast where it was referred to as the best model for Christians in the Middle East. But it's in danger of becoming a failed state. If this happens, sectarianism would increase. Furthermore, you'd have a failed state bordering both Israel and Syria. This would be detrimental to U.S. interests in the region. But there are three things that the U.S. can do to prevent Lebanon from failing. Number one is to increase humanitarian support for the Lebanese people. And we already do a great job at this, but we've got to do more, especially as it relates to K-12 education and healthcare, two sectors with acute needs. But also, Lebanon and the international community both need to have a better response to the Syrian refugee crisis. Number two, we've got to reinforce democracy in Lebanon. 3 years ago, Beirut port explosion, 220 people killed, thousands injured. To this day, no investigation because of political interference. Those responsible must be brought to justice. We've also got to reverse the state of economic freefall that Lebanon is in. The World Bank has referred to the situation there as the worst economic crisis since the mid-19th century. 80% of Lebanese are impoverished, and right now, the government, parliament, and the International Monetary Fund immediately need a dialogue on reforms and begin with this recovery. Crucially, Lebanon has gone a year with no president. No faction in parliament has the votes for their first choice candidate. We knew this a year ago, and we know it today. There's clearly a need to compromise, which I know sounds funny given where we're standing, but we know that Lebanon needs a reform-oriented president committed to putting the needs of the people first. And last, we need to strengthen security both in Lebanon and regionally. A crucial part of this is securing the border between Lebanon and Israel. A year ago, we had a historic accomplishment. There was a maritime boundary agreement between these two countries. We need to build on that. There are already talks about demarcating the land border between Lebanon and Israel. We've seen conflict on that border just this week. We need to put every effort we can behind this. But crucially, we've got to increase support for the Lebanese armed forces. They're our trusted partner in combating terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're also the leading institutional deterrent to Hezbollah, and they've directly confronted them and ended sectarian clashes, both in Tayune in 2021 and Kahale just this summer. They're also the leader in disrupting and dismantling Captagon trafficking from the Assad regime and Syria. In fact, this year, soldiers in the LAF have lost lives in this effort. So in conclusion, if Lebanon fails, the only experiment in pluralistic democracy in the region fails. It's bad for Christians, it's bad for religious freedom, it's bad for U.S. interests. So the U.S. has got to act. We need accountability for needed reforms, we need assistance for the people, and we need increased security support. And just remember, Lebanon is a message. Let's do what we can to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And I do apologize. I was mistaken. We do have one more speaker, and that is Sarah Salama, who is a human rights advocate for Coptic Christians. Sarah.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to IDC and Voice of the Martyrs for gathering us and hearing our plight. It's interesting sitting here listening to Congressman Smith, Congressman Sherman, Mr. Frank Wolf, and others speak about Artsakh, and I've heard them speak about this issue for the last 5 or 7 years, and I've heard Aram from the Armenian National Council himself speak on this issue maybe for the last 20 years, and just now we are coming to realize the deep consequences for not listening to those who speak out on behalf of these communities. While my heart goes out to our Armenian brothers and sisters, I do not want our Coptic Christian community in Egypt to be the next that we stand here and say they are being attacked in their homeland, they are being displaced, and we must help them. Coptic Christians are the indigenous people of Egypt, and with the ever-dwindling number of Christians in the Middle East, they are the last bastions of hope for the survival of Christianity in its very birthplace. Living under dimitude as a result of the Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th centuries, Copts have found themselves to be tolerated second-class citizens in their own home country. Today, this persecution persists. Coptic Christians in Egypt continue to endure discrimination by the state, by society at large, and experience common terrorist threats. Laws that are there to protect their rights are undermined, and justice is easily sidestepped by the perpetrators of injustice, creating an environment of impunity and making it impossible for Copts to realize their equal citizenship and live in the full scope of human dignity. Some ways that this is evident is their minimal representation in the upper echelons of government. While we compose over 10% of the Egyptian population, that's around 10 million people conservatively, we represent less than 1% of government positions and even less of military positions. Just as Congressman Frank Wolf noted, the history of the Copts is nowhere in primary and secondary education. It is as if between the Roman era and the Islamic conquest of Egypt, there was a dead space of time in which Copts did not exist. Even more, access to formal justice in instances of sectarian violence is severely limited by community reconciliation sessions that are ultimately designed to penalize Coptic victims. Most pertinently for me, the building of churches is severely limited in Egypt. The law is overbroad and shrouded in ambiguity, making it an impossible task to construct new churches. In fact, there are hundreds of villages in Egypt that have no access to church. I was visiting, one of the most interesting stories of my visits to Egypt was speaking to a small village community in Upper Egypt and telling them that I would convey a message to the United States, the Grand Savior. And I asked them, what would you like me to tell the United States government about your lived situation? A humble and weary priest got up and told us, we simply want to go to church. And that really encapsulates the core issue faced by Coptic Christians. The church is the only vestige left of their culture. It is the only place they commune. It is the only place they can learn about their language, about the last 2,000 years of their history. And we would like to preserve that community. So in closing, and as we've all witnessed throughout this week, the U.S.-Egypt alliance is up for a reform. As Congressman Frank Wolf, former Congressman Frank Wolf noted, we cannot keep giving billions of dollars to so-called allies that continue to disregard American values and continue to step all over our belief system and ignore these important human rights issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I want to thank our coalition partners, all of them. I want to thank certainly Representative Brad Sherman, as well as all other members, Congressman Smith, who's still with us, and of course, Mr. Wolf, a soldier that really did a lot for this cause. Thank you all for coming today, and we will be hanging around for a bit. If you have any questions or want to chat, we'll be happy to talk with you. Thank you all.